On March 2nd, Iran's most elite missile unit fired at one single address, the office of Benjamin Netanyahu. Then they released a statement that shook every intelligence agency on the planet. Netanyahu's fate is unclear, Israel responded, called it fake news. But here's what they didn't do. They didn't show him. For 4 long days, the most watched leader on earth simply vanished. Welcome to Currency Archives. Now, before we go any further, if you're watching this and you've been with us for a while, do us a small favor, the kind you'd ask of an old trusted friend. Press that subscribe button, because the kind of analysis we bring here, you won't find on your evening news. And we want to make sure it always finds you. Now tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching this from? Because this story is being felt everywhere. Wars are not always decided by weapons. Sometimes a single sentence does more damage than 1,000 missiles. And on March the 2nd, 2025, Iran released a sentence that stopped the world. It came from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, Iran's most elite, most feared military force. They issued a formal military statement, not a rumor, not a social media post, a documented official announcement from one of the most powerful military organizations on the planet. The statement said this: their KBAR ballistic missiles, the same weapons that had already struck targets across multiple countries in this war, had been fired at 2 specific addresses inside Israel. The first address was the official office of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The second was the private home of Israeli Air Force Commander Tomer Bar. The IRGC did not call these accidents. They did not describe them as collateral damage. They used precise military language. They called them targeted precision operations. They said the strikes were a surprise. And then they added 7 words that traveled faster than any missile Iran had ever launched. Netanyahu's fate is unclear. 7 words. That is all it took. Within hours, those 7 words were being read in Washington, in London, in Beijing, in every intelligence office, every trading floor, every government situation room that monitors the Middle East. The phrase did not just raise a question, it planted a doubt. And in geopolitics, a planted doubt is a precision weapon of its own. Now understand what the IRGC was actually doing here. They were not simply reporting a military result. They were making a calculation. A strategic, deliberate, carefully worded calculation designed to produce maximum uncertainty with minimum additional military cost. They knew exactly what those 7 words would do to global perception. They knew exactly what question every journalist, every analyst, and every government would immediately start asking. Where is Benjamin Netanyahu? Israel's Prime Minister's office responded the same day. Their statement was short. It was categorical. It called the IRGC's claims fake news. It said the Prime Minister was safe. But here's what the statement did not include. No video, no press conference, no live appearance, no time-stamped footage of Netanyahu speaking from a verified location, no visual evidence of any kind, just words on a page. In normal circumstances, that response would have closed the story immediately. A government denial, however brief, typically ends the news cycle. On claims of this nature, journalists move on, analysts file their notes, the world refocuses. But these were not normal circumstances, and serious analysts understood immediately why this denial felt different. Because the KBAR missile system that Iran referenced is not a theoretical weapon. It is not propaganda hardware that exists only in press releases. The KBAR, a domestically developed Iranian ballistic missile, had already demonstrated its operational capability multiple times during this conflict. It had struck documented targets. It had caused verified damage. It had reached coordinates that, weeks earlier, many analysts believed were beyond Iran's reliable strike range. So, when the IRGC attributed a strike to the KBAR system, the global intelligence community did not dismiss it. They evaluated it, and what they found, in the hours following the announcement, was not reassurance. What they found was silence. Not the ordinary silence of a government managing its communications carefully, but a specific, structured, sustained silence that serious observers of Israeli political life recognized as something different, something deliberate. For the business community watching this unfold, the moment carried a warning that went far beyond the military dimension. Leadership uncertainty, whether real or perceived, is one of the most dangerous economic conditions a nation at war can face. It does not require confirmation. It does not require proof. It only requires that the question remains open long enough for markets to begin pricing in the worst-case scenario. And on March 2nd, the question was open. Netanyahu's office had issued a denial, but Netanyahu himself had not been seen. There's a weapon that does not explode. It does not leave craters. It does not trigger air raid sirens. It cannot be intercepted by Iron Dome or any defense system ever built. It is called silence, and in the days following March the 2nd, Israel deployed it with the same precision that Iran had deployed its missiles. To understand what happened next, one must first understand the information architecture that Israel constructed around itself the moment this war began. Because what looked like a media blackout to outside observers was in fact something far more deliberate, far more calculated, and far more revealing than the Israeli government intended it to be. Since February 28th, Israel had been operating under strict wartime media restrictions. These were not informal guidelines, these were legal directives. International press could not freely access strike zones inside Israeli territory. Any damage sustained by Israeli military infrastructure, bases, command facilities, leadership locations, was legally suppressed from publication. Israeli media outlets were prohibited from reporting on IDF casualties or facility damage without receiving explicit official clearance first. In practical terms, this meant one thing. The government controlled almost everything the Israeli public, and the watching world, was allowed to see about what was happening inside Israel's borders. Now, on its own, wartime media restriction is not unusual. Every serious military power in the world has used information controls during active conflict. The United States did it. The United Kingdom did it. Russia does it. It is a recognized tool of wartime governance. But here is what makes Israel's specific blackout significant in this precise moment. When a government restricts information during war, it creates a vacuum, and a vacuum does not stay empty. It fills. Immediately and automatically it fills, with speculation, with rumor, with worst-case assumptions, and with the narratives of whoever is most aggressively trying to fill it. In this case, that party was Iran. Iran did not need to fire another missile after March 2nd to maintain pressure on Israel's political foundation. They had already fired the most important one. The question, where is Netanyahu, was now living inside the vacuum that Israel's own blackout had created. And every hour that passed without a clear, verifiable, time-stamped answer was an hour that Iran's narrative continued to grow. Now examine what actually happened across those critical days. For 4 to 5 days following the IRGC's strike claim, Benjamin Netanyahu did not appear on live video. He did not hold a press conference. He did not post a real-time address to the Israeli public or to the international community. He did not sit before cameras in a verified, clearly dated setting and speak. What appeared instead were fragments. On March 6th, Israeli media reported that Netanyahu visited the Beit Shemesh missile shelter site, the location where 9 Israeli civilians had been killed inside a bomb shelter. The visit was reported, but the verification was limited. No sustained live broadcast, no extended public appearance that the international press could independently confirm and timestamp. On March 7th, his office published a written statement. Words again. Not a face, not a voice. Not a living, breathing, time-stamped presence. And here is the strategic reality that the business community must understand clearly. In the modern information environment, a partial appearance does not resolve uncertainty. It feeds it. Because the question changes. It is no longer simply, is he alive? It becomes, why is he only appearing in controlled, limited fragments? And that second question is more dangerous than the first. Markets do not wait for confirmation. Investors do not wait for press conferences. Institutional capital does not sit patiently while governments manage their communications. Capital moves on perception. And the perception being constructed, not by conspiracy theorists, but by the structural logic of the information environment itself, was that something inside Israeli leadership was not functioning normally. The missiles had done their visible damage, but the vacuum was doing something far more difficult to repair. It was eroding confidence, quietly, systematically, without a single additional weapon being fired. And the world was watching every second of it. There's a moment in every conflict when the battlefield shifts, when the fighting moves away from borders and missile trajectories and relocates to something far more invisible, far more difficult to defend against, and far more consequential for the global economy than any physical strike ever recorded. That moment had arrived, and most people did not recognize it when it did. What Iran executed after March the 2nd was not a continuation of conventional warfare. It was a masterclass in something that military strategists have studied for decades, but that the general public rarely sees clearly until the damage is already done. It was information warfare, deliberate, structured, economically targeted, and it was working. To understand the scale of what Iran was doing, one must step back from the daily headlines and look at the architecture of the strategy itself. Iran's objective was never simply to strike Netanyahu's office. The KBAR missile was the trigger, but the real weapon was the 7 words that followed the trigger. Netanyahu's fate is unclear. That phrase was not a battlefield report. It was a carefully engineered instrument designed to accomplish 3 specific things simultaneously. First, destabilize Israeli political confidence from the inside. A nation whose leadership appears uncertain cannot project strength. It cannot negotiate from a position of authority. It cannot reassure its own population, its military commanders, or its international allies that the decision-making structure at the top remains intact and functioning. Second, create paralysis in Israel's military command structure. When there is genuine public uncertainty about whether the commander-in-chief is operational, subordinate commanders begin operating with less clarity. Decisions slow down. Coordination becomes more cautious. The rhythm of military operations, which depends entirely on clear, confident, top-down authority, begins to fracture at the edges. Third, and most critically for the audience watching this channel, destroy investor confidence faster than any physical strike could. Because here is the economic reality that most news coverage completely missed. Markets had already been reacting to the physical dimension of this war. Brent crude had climbed to $119 per barrel, a 60% increase in just 10 days. $6 trillion had been wiped from global stock markets. The Nikkei had dropped 7%. The Kospi had fallen 8%. Samsung alone had lost 12% of its market value. These were the numbers produced by physical infrastructure strikes, refineries, supply chains, naval corridors, energy facilities. But leadership uncertainty produces a different category of economic damage entirely. Physical strikes damage what already exists. They destroy infrastructure that can, over time, be rebuilt. Insurance mechanisms activate, supply chains reroute, governments implement emergency protocols. The damage is severe, but it is finite. It has a ceiling. Leadership uncertainty has no ceiling when institutional investors, the pension funds, the sovereign wealth managers, the hedge funds that move billions across borders in a single transaction, begin questioning whether the government of a nuclear-armed nation at war has a functioning leadership structure. They do not wait for clarification. They do not schedule a meeting for next Tuesday to reassess their position. They exit immediately, quietly, and at a scale that ordinary market observers only understand weeks later when they look back at the data and ask what caused the sudden movement. This is precisely what serious analysts were watching in the days following March the 2nd. Not the missile strike itself, not the IRGC statement, but the capital behavior of major institutional players who had exposure to Israeli bonds, regional energy assets, and Middle Eastern market positions. The money was moving. And it was moving because Iran had understood something about modern economic warfare that its adversaries had underestimated. You do not need to destroy a country's economy directly. You only need to make its leadership appear unreliable for long enough. And the global financial system will do the rest of the work for you, automatically, efficiently. And at a scale no military operation could replicate. This is not a new concept. History has recorded it precisely. In 1956, uncertainty surrounding the Suez Crisis leadership decisions triggered capital flight from the British pound, so severe that it effectively ended Britain's role as a global superpower, not the military operation itself, but the perception of leadership instability surrounding it. In 2003, the weeks of ambiguity preceding the Iraq invasion caused oil markets to price in scenarios that never materialized, costing global supply chains hundreds of billions in hedging costs alone. In each case, the information environment did more lasting economic damage than the physical conflict. Iran's strategists knew this history. They were not improvising, they were executing. And as March moved forward, as Netanyahu remained absent from sustained live public view, as Israel's blackout continued feeding the vacuum, as Witkoff and Kushner prepared to board a flight to Tel Aviv, the global business community was sitting with a question that no official statement had yet answered. Not who fired the missile, but who is actually in charge. And in the world of capital, that question is the most expensive one there is. In diplomacy, it is rarely what is said that matters most. It is who gets on the plane. And on March 10th, two very specific men boarded a flight to Israel. Their names were Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. And the moment serious analysts registered those two names traveling together to Tel Aviv on that specific date, the conversation changed entirely. Because in the architecture of American foreign policy, these were not diplomats. They were not career State Department officials following a routine bilateral agenda. They were not sent to discuss trade agreements or cultural exchanges, or the kind of low-stakes diplomatic business that fills embassy calendars on ordinary days. And they were flying in at precisely the moment the world was asking where Netanyahu was. To understand why this visit carried the weight that it did, one must understand who Steve Witkoff actually is in the context of this conflict. Witkoff was not a peripheral figure. He was Trump's primary back channel across every major regional negotiation that had taken place since the war began. The Gaza ceasefire framework, the hostage release negotiations, the indirect talks with Iran that took place in Oman before the war escalated to its current scale, the Geneva back channel discussions that sought and ultimately failed to establish a diplomatic off-ramp before missiles started flying. Every critical conversation that Washington did not want on official record. Witkoff was the man in the room. He was not sent places for ceremony, he was sent places for outcomes. And then there was Kushner. Jared Kushner's presence added a second layer of strategic weight that cannot be dismissed. Kushner's architecture of the Abraham Accords had fundamentally restructured the relationship between Israel and the Arab world in ways that professional diplomats had declared impossible for 30 years. He understood the personal dynamics of Middle Eastern leadership, not from briefing papers, but from direct, sustained, high-stakes relationship building over years. When Kushner travels to a conflict zone alongside Witkoff, it is not background noise. It is a signal. The question serious analysts were asking on March 10th was not simply what these two men were going to discuss with Netanyahu. The deeper question, the one that the business community and institutional investors needed to answer, was what the timing of this visit revealed about the actual state of Israeli leadership. Consider the logic carefully. If Netanyahu's government was functioning with full, uninterrupted authority, if the IRGC's claims had been genuinely dismissed as the propaganda the Israeli PMO described them as, if the 4 to 5 day absence from sustained public view was simply a matter of wartime security protocols and nothing more, then why did Washington feel it necessary to send its two most senior Middle East operatives to Israel on March 10th? Routine diplomacy does not require Witkoff. It does not require Kushner. It does not require both of them simultaneously on the same flight to the same destination at the same moment. And that assessment told the world something that no official statement from either Jerusalem or Washington was willing to say publicly. Something had shifted inside Israeli leadership. Not necessarily what Iran had claimed, but something significant enough that the most powerful government on earth decided that a phone call was insufficient, that a written communique was insufficient, that a mid-level envoy was insufficient, something that required the two men Trump trusted most to physically get on a plane and sit across a table. For the global business community, this is where the strategic economic warning becomes impossible to ignore. Leadership transitions, even temporary, even partial, even unconfirmed, during active military conflict produce a specific and well-documented sequence of economic consequences. First comes the uncertainty premium. Oil prices hold elevated or climb further as markets refuse to price in stabilization, while command authority remains in question. At $119 per barrel, every additional day of leadership uncertainty adds cost to every supply chain on Earth that moves anything, anywhere. Second comes the institutional exit. Sovereign wealth funds and major pension managers who had maintained regional exposure begin quietly reducing positions, not in panic, but in the calm, systematic way that professionals manage risk when the variable they cannot model, leadership continuity, remains unresolved. Third comes the alliance recalculation. Every government that has a security relationship with Israel begins privately reassessing what that relationship means if the decision-making structure in Jerusalem is operating below full capacity. Qatar had already signaled it would not join the war against Iran. Other regional actors were watching, measuring, waiting. And fourth, and most consequentially for entrepreneurs and young business leaders watching this channel, comes the opportunity cost of prolonged uncertainty itself. Every week that this question remains unanswered, every week that leadership continuity in one of the Middle East's most economically connected nations remains publicly unresolved, is a week in which capital that would otherwise move into the region stays frozen. Investment decisions that would otherwise be made get delayed. Contracts that would otherwise be signed get reviewed. Partnerships that would otherwise be formalized get paused. Uncertainty does not just cost money in the present, it costs the future. Witkoff and Kushner landed in Tel Aviv on March 10th. The meetings were scheduled, the conversations were private, the outcomes were not immediately disclosed to the press, but the fact that they came was itself the answer to the question the whole world had been asking since March 2nd. Something was not normal. And in a world where oil was at $119, where $6 trillion had already vanished from global markets, where Iran had demonstrated it could move financial systems with 7 words rather than 7 missiles, normal was not coming back anytime soon.